Hello, assembled guests, ladies and gentlemen, delegates. This, I understand, is the most attended World Press Freedom Day yet. It is great to be here 250 years since the first Declaration of Freedom of Information, which was created, signed, and implemented into law on the territory of what is now modern-day Sweden and Finland. I hope I've got that right. So it's great to be in Helsinki particularly, and we thank the Finnish government for their invitation. It's wonderful to have this distinguished panel, and particularly our keynote speaker, who I'm going to introduce in a moment. And our particular panel is about protecting your rights, or protecting people's rights, surveillance, overreach, data protection, and online censorship. That is something that really affects our lives as citizens and our lives as journalists, and lives, you know, for those in government and elsewhere as well. But before I do that, I would like to draw everybody's attention, both in this room and outside this room. So whoever wants to tweet, to post, to create as much of a storm as possible on the idea of freeing, protecting, respecting our journalists and our press and our colleagues who are now in jail. One of the great opportunities that I have as UNESCO Goodwill Ambassador for the freedom of expression and safety of journalists is that I am very grateful to be able to have this platform, to be able to lobby for and work for the freedom of our colleagues who are hauled in behind bars, often for no reason whatsoever, in these very draconian political climates in certain countries around the world. And right now we have a lot of journalists in jail, which we're going to highlight. People who've been harassed, intimidated, and as I said, in many cases, wrongfully arrested just for doing their job. And as we know, and as I've said many, many times, journalism, it is not a crime. It is actually a great aid for civil society and the furtherance of democracy. So our slot, we are here to help the world, not to hinder the world. And the backlash against journalists today is really unacceptable, and sadly it is growing. They're, as I say, often locked up on trumped up charges, held with no recourse to the rule of law. Governments and civil society, along with UNESCO and the UN system, do have a role to play in raising awareness of this issue. The US State Department has highlighted several such cases in their annual Free the Press campaign. For instance, Jose Antonio Torres is in jail in Cuba, Mohammad Bekyanov in Uzbekistan, Mohammad Sedir Kabuvand in Iran, Sergei Reznik in Russia, Mehmet Can Abdullah in China, Wubishet Taye in Ethiopia. And those are just a few. I also am an honorary member now. I've been a member for a long time on the board of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and I've worked with them for many, many years. A few years ago, I, as part of another activist committee for journalism, the International IWMF, the International Women's Media Foundation, gave a prize to Khadija Ismailova for her brave reporting on her country, as Azerbaijan. Today, Khadija is in jail. She was the winner of this year's UNESCO Guillermo Cano World Press Freedom Day Prize. She's an investigative journalist, as we all know. She has been reporting with RFE-RL in Azerbaijan. She's known for her very courageous reporting on corruption and on the ruling family. She's been accused of embezzlement, tax evasion, abuse of power, and she's been sentenced to 7.5 years in prison. Today, as I said, is her 516th day in prison, and here from this stage, I personally, and I'm sure many of you would join me, in calling on the Azerbaijan government to free her. That is what should be done, because she is just a civilian wielding a pen and paper, perhaps some social media tools, and doing her job, which is shining light in dark corners and being everybody's eyes and ears when it comes to knowing the world and figuring out what's going on. There's also Mahmoud Abu Zaid, who's better known as Shawkan. He's a freelance photojournalist who is currently imprisoned in Egypt. He was detained August 14th, 2013, while he was covering those clashes now famous during the dispersal of the pro-Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood sit-ins in Cairo. Today marks his 994th day in prison. And again, I call on the Egyptian government to do for him what they did to our other colleagues, the journalists from Al Jazeera who were finally freed. This is a good example of what can be done and how disagreements and misunderstandings can be cleared up with talk, with interface and with mediation, how those of us in this platform and elsewhere can help open the eyes perhaps and explain some of what our journalists are doing, and explain that they are not evildoers or anti-state crusaders. They are simply activists and crusaders for the truth. So I hope that Mahmoud Abu Zaid will also be freed. And finally, Mohammed Sheikh Oud Mohammed, a blogger and freelancer in Mauritania. He was convicted and sentenced to death for apostasy in 2014 for an article he wrote. In that article, he criticized the caste system in his country, and he said that followers of Islam interpreted the religion according to circumstance. Later, he apologized for that. Last month, though, an appeals court upheld his conviction, and he has just one appeal left before it gets, and that appeal is before the Supreme Court. So, again, we must do more, and we appeal again to the authorities and the government of Mauritania to make sure that he is freed, and not to mix up political and religious disagreements and make those punishable crimes. So here's some good news, though. After a whole load of lobbying, we are joined in this plenary by two alumni of the list of those who once were in jail. The State Department and IREX Europe have brought Avaz Zainalov and Natalia Radzina to celebrate their freedom. They stand up right now. Let's give them a hand. It's great to see. It's really great to see how the system can work. And I know, again, as a UNESCO Goodwill Ambassador, and I'm sure on behalf of the Director General, Irina Bukova, who's sitting here, and all the really hardworking, well-intentioned people who work in the UN system and at UNESCO, really know that this is an important issue. So delighted to be able to highlight that today from this panel. Now we move on to the business at hand, and that is, how do we deal with our connected internet system? We're all plugged in. It's all social media. It's all online. But there are many opportunities and equally many challenges to try to work through. So let me first introduce our panel, hopefully in order of the way they're going to happen. Mikko Hipponen is going to be making the keynote speech in a moment. He's the Chief Research Officer for F-Secure here in Finland, and he's a world-class cyber criminality expert and the Chief Research Officer of F-Secure on online security here based in Helsinki, and he's done a lot of writing about this, including on CNN.com. Just before you start, Mikko, let me just go through our panelists. Next to you is Danilo Doneda, the independent consultant and professor at the State University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and he is also teaching at the State University, serving as an advisor to the Consumer Office of the Ministry of Justice and also to the Brazilian Internet Steering Committee. So a very important point of view from him. Then next to him, Christian Guilherme Fernandes, Ambassador and Deputy Permanent Representative of the great country of Costa Rica, which I've had the pleasure to visit and love it. He is the representative to the UN in Geneva, and he has broad experience in these multilateral affairs that are needed when it comes to this kind of topic. Lina Atala, the co-founder and chief editor of Mada Masr in Egypt, and this is a Cairo-based news website that, in her words, attempts to secure a house for a dislocated practice of journalism that did not survive in mainstream organizations and their associated political and economic conditions. She's written widely, and we do know that there is as we've just mentioned, to a large extent, a great crisis in journalism in Egypt, and it presumably gets even more intense when it comes to online. Marietje Schaake, member of the European Parliament from the Netherlands, and she's been serving as I said, a member of the European Parliament since 2009. She is the ALDE coordinator of the International Trade Committee and the spokesman for the ALD Group on Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. So, very, very important voice on this because she is strongly committed to an open internet in discussions, including how it works for governance. And then close to me, Rebecca McKinnon, who I know best as my former colleague at CNN. She was in charge first of our Beijing bureaus and then in Tokyo. And she has since left, and she's now the project director, ranking digital rights. It's based in the US. And you know how certain organizations rank countries in terms of freedom and other such issues? Well, her project that she is now directing ranks corporations. And she's also an author, she's a media activist, and she has been at the, I'm going to get it wrong, well, now you're at the Annenberg School, right? You were, okay, great. So she has a huge amount of expertise, and actually, if I remember, was one of the first to come out and start writing about the challenges of our digital world and the opportunities. So Mikko, with no further ado, let's have your keynote speech. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you to all of you for being here in my hometown, Helsinki. My name is Mikko Hyppönen and I hunt hackers. I hunt hackers for a living. I hunt hackers, the evil kind of hackers, the criminal hackers, not the good hackers, the white hat hackers who actually try to secure our technology, but the evil hackers who will try to steal our money or who will try to steal our privacy. And I love the internet. I think it's the best innovation our generation has done. However, it's quite clear that it has also brought us completely new kinds of risks. Before the internet, we only had to worry about criminals who were living in our city. Now, today, because of the internet, we have to worry about criminals who can be anywhere in the world. But don't get me wrong. It's quite clear that the internet has brought us more good than bad. The internet has brought us so much connectivity, so much business, so much entertainment, that the bad sides it has created pale in comparison. And I would like to think that exactly the same thing will apply to the revolution which is underway right now, which is what we call the Internet of Things, where all our appliances will be connected to the internet. You can think about the Internet of Things in a way that any device that we use to connect to the electricity grid, we will in the future connect to the electricity grid and to the internet grid. So your toasters, your washing machines, everything will be online. And yes, that will bring completely new kinds of risks. But I hope it will bring us more benefits than risks, just like the internet itself did. So I've been doing this now for 25 years. And during those 25 years, I've seen the bad sides of the internet. I've seen the growth of online organized crime and all the kinds of ways organized criminals make hundreds of millions and billions in profit, in criminal profit, with attacks like banking Trojans and ransom Trojans and credit card theft with keyloggers and on and on. But right now, over the last couple of years, the biggest changes in this field have not been with online crime. They've been with governments entering the offensive cyber attack business. Governments using malware, governments using hacking to do intelligence gathering and to wage war. And this is a major development because we are the first generation in mankind's history who can be tracked throughout their lives through technology. We are the first generation that can be tracked like this. And we don't really understand what that actually means. What does that actually imply when third parties can monitor where we are, where do we travel, who do we communicate with, what do we communicate about? And it's not just governments that can do this kind of tracking. There's several third parties that can actually do this. And this is a clear problem, because we don't really see what this will mean in the long run. Now, obviously governments do intelligence gathering because that's why they have intelligence agencies. And some intelligence agents have described problems they have today in doing their work because of encryption that we have on our devices. Encryption technologies, strong end-to-end encryption. We saw this discussion, for example, between FBI and Apple just last month. Some intelligence agencies have described this problem as living in the dark ages of intelligence gathering because they can't see what's being discussed because of encryption. And that's not true. We are not living in the dark ages of intelligence gathering. We are living in the golden age of intelligence gathering. So much metadata is being leaked from our devices, from our computers, from our smartphones and tablets all the time as we use it. Yes, small part of that is encrypted end to end, which cannot be read because of the technology protecting it. But vast amount of information, metadata, is being leaked and collected about our daily lives. It is not the dark ages, it is the golden ages. And to protect our privacy in the online world, we have to rely on technology. Now, we cannot make strong encryption go away. No matter what intelligence agencies or governments say, they cannot really regulate strong encryption. They cannot really outlaw strong encryption. Why? Because strong encryption is math. It's mathematics. And those mathematic algorithms have been invented. They have been published. You can go to any library today and get a book which will describe to you how to create strong end-to-end encryption mechanisms. How strong? Well, so strong that a single message encrypted with strong encryption mechanism cannot be decrypted. Or actually, it can be decrypted, but the decryption process is so slow that even if you would collect every single computer on the planet, and you would use the power of every computing device we have to crack one single message, they would eventually crack it. But it would take close to 100 million years to complete the crack. And in 100 million years, your messages don't matter anymore. So strong encryption, as technology is known, we can't make it go away. So if we outlaw strong encryption, then we, normal people, will not have protection. But the bad people will still have it. If you outlaw encryption, then only outlaws will have encryption. So I work at F-Secure. We try to provide security and privacy to people. We protect thousands and thousands of journalists while they do their daily work. One thing that how we do that is with VPN solutions that people can run on their phones, on their tablets, on their computers. And here I'd like to announce to all of you that we have, especially for this event, we're now providing a free VPN license of our Freedom VPN to every single journalist here today to help you make your work. You can visit our booth here to look at it. Another service that we are providing here is that we actually have forensics experts on location. So if you're worried about your device, if you're worried whether it might have some kind of bugging device on it or some software that follows your work, we have specialists here. You can actually go there and give your device for a checkup, and we will see if there's any problems on your device to give you that peace of mind. Because we want to support your work. Because we want to support privacy. Because we believe in privacy. And the reason why we believe in privacy is that without privacy, we can't have free press. And without free press, we cannot have democracy. And without democracy, we can't have freedom. So thank you for your work. Thank you.
Mikko, thank you very much. That is incredibly tantalizing, and obviously would have loved to have heard a lot more, but I think we can pick up the points that you raised and deconstruct them, or discuss them anyway, on this stage. Can I first ask Rebecca, because not just because you're sitting right next to me, but because for me, obviously, the biggest issue is what Mikko said and what we all know is about freedom of the press. How do we manage to protect that freedom of the press and be free responsibly in this internet age? How do we balance the right of information, not just for us to gather, but to disseminate, with privacy and data protection? What issues and challenges do you come across? What sort of things do you deal with? How can you answer that question for us?
You can read my book. No, sorry. I mean, a lot of people talk about how privacy and freedom of expression are in contrast or contradiction with one another. I disagree with that. Actually, you need privacy in order to have freedom of expression. For the reason that a journalist needs to be able to communicate with their sources confidentially in order to get the reports out. We need privacy so that we can have whistleblowing, so that we can have freedom of expression, freedom of the press. So the ability to communicate privately goes hand in hand with the ability to have dissent, to have human rights advocacy, to have freedom of the press, to have democratic discourse. The Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, David Kay, has written about the importance of being able to be anonymous as well in order to have freedom of the press, in order to have freedom of expression online, and also why it is therefore very important that ordinary citizens, in addition to journalists, have real, robust encryption for exactly the reasons that Mikko stated. And we can talk a little bit more. One of the other complications in this digital world is that journalists are doing their work by and large, when you're using the internet in any way to carry out your work, you're depending on what some might call internet intermediaries, primarily companies, the internet service providers, often the social media platforms. Journalists are all on Twitter to get their reports out. They're on Facebook. They're communicating with sources on Facebook and Twitter as well. And so the policies and practices of these companies have a huge impact on our freedom of speech, on our privacy, and ultimately on freedom of the press. And these companies are, of course, subject to a great deal of regulation and demands by governments to assist with surveillance and censorship, but they also carry out their own private enforcement. They set their own rules for what you can and cannot do, whether or not you're able to use a false name or whether you have to comply with real name ID. And they're also, for commercial purposes, collecting and sharing a lot of data. And we have a problem with companies not being sufficiently accountable to the public. It's been affirmed by the United Nations at a number of levels that businesses, companies have a responsibility to respect human rights, and that obviously includes freedom of expression and privacy, and it's appropriate to hold companies accountable to these principles. And I'm sure the other panelists will be able to talk more about that. But we need, I think, in order to prevent abuse by governments and by companies against journalists, against citizens trying to communicate with journalists, against citizens trying to commit journalism, in order to prevent that abuse, both of our free expression and privacy, we need accountability and we need transparency of governments and companies. We need governments to be very clear about the types of requests and demands they're placing on companies, and we need companies to be clear about how they're responding to those demands and also what they're doing with their own private rules and practices. Because if we don't know how power is being abused and exercised in the digital realm, we can't hold it accountable, and journalism and democracy will suffer.
Let me pick up and run with part of that. You know, we need governments to be accountable and transparent. We just heard Mikko talking about the need also for governments and others, those who are in the business of intelligence gathering, to be able to do their work as well. And I think there are a couple of things which have highlighted recently the dilemma here. One, the fight between the FBI and Apple over the San Bernardino telephone, which eventually the FBI solved by going, I believe, to Israel, getting a specialist hacker and getting into that telephone. Then we have the other issue, which is massive, and that is in the current super sophisticated social media savvy brigade, band, battalions of terrorists. They almost have outwitted us at our own technology. And many military, many intelligence, many civilians are saying that they are getting radicalized faster than we can de-radicalize, and I'm quoting now mosques and communities. And not only that, they are, as I say, every time you bring one of them down, like Twitter does, Google, all those people take them down when they're known, you know, if they're known terrorists using social media, they put them up again in different names and this and that. So I just want to ask, maybe from a government perspective or an MP perspective, I'm going to ask you, Marietje, first, because Europe is facing a crisis of terrorism right now, with a huge amount of that being waged online. Mm-hmm. So Mikko says we're in the golden age. Some people say we're in the dark ages. Where are we in this issue?
Well, I think generally we are facing a moment where the speed with which technologies develop in general, with which the frontier of what's possible is pushed forward, is almost impossible to be caught up or to keep pace with by democratic decision making. And so I think we need to really broaden this discussion, not to step away from the very important issue of press freedom and the position of journalists. That is the focus today, but I think really the question is, how can we ensure that the rule of law still applies in a hyper-connected environment, and that the very principles such as universal human rights that we believe in and cherish can still be enforced. And that is a crucial question, and a question in which I think governments have to realize very well what principles they do want to preserve and how they avoid outsourcing a lot of responsibilities to the private sector. Because of course, hate speech, radicalizing, calling for violence are serious questions to tackle. And the public has to be protected against it. At the same time, I personally believe that with a very robust freedom of expression, a very lively debate, we may well be best positioned to protect our open societies against not only attacks from the outside, which is what terrorism seeks to do, but also against erosion from within. And that last point, eroding the very freedoms that we're seeking to protect, is a very serious problem these days, in which private companies play a major role. Because there is a slippery slope that we're witnessing, particularly online, where governments seek to increasingly outsource the decisions of what content should be or should not be accessible to people.
What do you mean by outsource?
They leave the decision-making of what content should be available, like which posts get deleted from Facebook or from other social media, to the private sector. Mm-hmm. And I think we have to make sure that there's always checks and balances, judiciary oversight, democratic oversight in these very important decisions, and that we do not face a situation where public policy or public interest decisions are made by private sector operators without public oversight. Mm. And that is a real risk right now, which is exacerbated by the terrorist threat that you highlighted.
Quickly, Rebecca, because I want to go to the other side.
Very quick anecdotal point for what can go wrong when censorship is outsourced to companies. Late last year, a large number of women who happened to be named ISIS, because ISIS was a women's name before it was
a god's name,
yeah.
goddess of wisdom.
a large number of women named ISIS had their Facebook accounts deactivated from just for no reason, and the only people who got their accounts reinstated, as far as we know, we don't know how many people were affected, were those who got media attention. That most of the people who had this problem reported just sort of getting nowhere in their appeals. So this is one example of how the companies are responding to government pressure to police their platforms, and all kinds of mistakes are getting made. And we hear all the time about journalists operating in the Middle East who get content taken down because somehow it got caught up in a countering violent extremism kind of program that a company was running.
Well, I think generally, increasingly, national security is cited as a key reason to legitimize the takedown of content, also when it's political opposition or when it's critical journalism that is being taken down. So we have to be also very vigilant in looking at when there's legitimate national security concerns that may require a judge to seek to take down information, or whether it is an excuse to actually crack down on legitimate speech.
Well, let me ask Christian Fernandez that, because you are representing a government and a nation here. So what about legitimate national security concerns versus what may be, not very pleasant politically or in terms of image or whatever, the unacceptable barrier between censorship and freedom? Because we're seeing more and more of that. Obviously, we have talked now and highlighted so many journalists who are actually behind bars being politically attacked because of what they do, but also because of how visible they are and how unanonymous they are because of the proliferation of social media. So how do you wage and make these decisions? Or how should a government?
Thank you very much, Christian. And first of all, let me join the words of solidarity with all those journalists who are in prison all around the world. As Costa Rican, we really want to raise our voice for them. But historically, the national security concerns was a very good excuse for everything. Mm-hmm. And now it's exactly the same, but it's no new. Also in the fight against terrorism in the beginning of the 2000s, when the 9/11 occurs, we had a lot of excess on this regard, and big democracies rule against the essential human rights. And this is quite a challenge now. What is the situation for the countries, I think, is that we need to have a very strong institution, a robust institutional architecture to have the rule of law assured, like our colleague in the panel said. And the national security will be always a very good excuse for all the abuses. And now, what is more important is that we need also to look at the prevention and education, how we are using those tools, because those tools are really empowering people, and they are giving us the possibility to have more political participation. We are, which is mean, in one hand, we have benefits and for sure wrong things, but let's have also an approach regarding the prevention and education on the use of that. But another point, what I think is a very important one, is that probably in human rights, which is the most difficult thing, is the implementation of the human rights. We can have agreement in this room and the UN on some big values and things. But when it comes to the ground, at the national level, and when you have to talk and have impact on the people on the ground, is where you have the problems. Mm-hmm. And probably we need to think about how the UN and all the international organizations can help us, UNESCO, or I don't know, the council, the Human Rights Council, who has this UPR, the review by peers, by all the countries, how we can raise the freedom of expression and the privacy, the right to privacy, to have a strong position on that and to look at. And probably, all the countries, mostly the countries has national institutions on human rights, and probably we can also ask them to look at what are the situation of the freedom of expression and privacy.
Two questions there. One, you talk about, educating people on how to be able to make these decisions and figure out ways of these guarantees and safeties. But then in the United States, which holds itself up as the world leader in terms of freedom of expression, human rights, I mean, the FBI won. Okay, it didn't get Apple to cave, but it managed to hack into a phone. And some people, I would probably bet the majority of the people in the United States were pleased. They thought, this is a terrorist, and the guys have got, his phone. Turns out, apparently, they didn't find anything. But that's also a really difficult issue to educate on, because there are many, many people who believe that our law enforcement and others should have the right to be able to, quote unquote, keep us safe by whatever means necessary.
We need to continue to educate, because this same country thinks that the death penalty will decrease the criminality, and it's not true. Which is we are discussing here very big issues. Yeah. It's not easy, and probably my colleague coming from the justice side will say how difficult it is to rule in a situation when you have privacy and national security. For sure, I think that if you ask now to the Belgians, if they wanted to go inside all the emails of the people, probably they will say, please go ahead, because we don't want terrorists, we don't want to be in this situation. But it's a very difficult, I don't have an answer for that.
But it's fundamental, and I will move to Danilo in a second, because it is fundamental, because again, it comes back to the backlash against the press. If you go to a place like Russia, or you go to any other place where there are an extraordinary number of journalists in jail, you will again find that the majority of the people actually accept what their government's doing, and they think those who are being targeted somehow deserve to be targeted. So I think that's a really, again, it is obviously political, so there's political and democratic education, but also, Danilo, in terms of what Christian said, from the justice point of view, how do you deal with this kind of issue? But I've just come back from your country, and I think, it goes to the heart of governance as well. There's almost like a sort of a Tahrir Square. I say that, advisedly, because I'm coming to Lina in a second. But there's a street movement which some call anti-democratic in Brazil, that is using social media and the ability to organize and all sorts of things to bring down a democratically elected president. No matter what you think, and we're not talking politics here, this is also a big issue.
Yes, Christian, it's very interesting that the social media is being used for both sides in Brazil. But firstly, let me say that I agree very much with Rebecca McKinnon when she said that privacy and freedom of expression are not opposed at all. There are many situations when we need privacy in order to have a minimum amount of liberty, personal liberty and dignity to have something to express, not only on protecting sources, but on considering that today, even the receptor of information must have privacy in order to read anonymously, in order to study, in order to receive information without being cataloged, without being labeled for which information he receives. With regards to the question, Christian said very, very well that it's very difficult to have an answer to this challenge we have right now, but in Brazil, we're struggling with similar situations in the sense that, for instance, we don't know for sure if the content of communications is so important in order to law enforcement to be so more effective. In order to, I don't believe that we count with actual data which tell us that if we have actual communications data, so we have the justification to break encryption and at all, we really are going to have a police, a law enforcement system which is so much more effective. The raw data we have on the situation is not conclusive, but it seems to me that there's so much to be done in the global level on this issue. And I would add also that, just as an example, in Brazil, we're facing a kind of strange situation in which the WhatsApp, the message application, which is being used by more than 100 million Brazilians right now, is blocked on the country for 72 hours since yesterday because not of a question, magistrate, first level magistrate, decided that WhatsApp should stop working until they produce data of communications involving drug dealers. The thing is that WhatsApp doesn't have, we don't know for sure because all the trial is under secret.
So this is totally separate from the political problem.
It's totally separate.
They want to get information about drug dealers, and that's why they've cancelled WhatsApp.
Nothing is totally separate from the political problem. But the thing is that it is mostly a law enforcement problem and a judicial problem, because in Brazil a magistrate can order something like this, because even with the Internet Civil Rights Framework, Marco Civil Internet, we haven't built a culture which makes the magistrate understand that there must be some proportionality between his decisions, his cautelar decisions, which may affect people which depends on the app for a living. People talk to their doctors through WhatsApp in Brazil, and so on. And this decision, which was based on a very singular case, but it has to be obeyed. So it's a kind of a situation that can maybe lead us to a struggle like FBI versus Apple in US, but frankly, before that is a question of measuring the proportionality. A step further, the problem about the data about law enforcement said.
Okay. Thank you, Danilo. Let's turn now to Lina Atala, again, co-founder and chief editor of Madame Massa in Egypt. I guess two questions, Lina. One is the governance issue, because you are the original Google revolution, which now most people believe was not a Google revolution, and if it was a Google revolution, was a failed revolution. So what is your analysis in that regard? And then when it comes directly to the surveillance and the harassment by the state of journalists in this regard, you have one of the most severely politicized press situations in the world right now. How does this surveillance issue, affect?
Yeah, with regards to the first question, I'm one of the people who do not like to consider the question of the internet vis-a-vis the mobilizations in a binary form, in the sense that if it's not an online revolution, it is an offline revolution. Of course, it is a situation where the mobilizations could only happen on the ground and could only have traction away from the urban centers of the capital city and to, attract other people, because it was very much offline. But of course, the fact that we've been active online for years preceding this mobilization meant the possibility of the amplification of the mobilization. So for me, it's kind of a resolved matter. I think it's naive to think of it as a Google revolution alone, but it's also equally naive to just constantly debunk this narrative by saying that, well, it only happened on the ground, and when it was happening on the ground, of course, there was the famous communications blackout that the previous government has established in order to try to limit the mobilizations, and it didn't. I think it's both elements are important in a wider and more complex historization of how this mobilization happened. As far as surveillance is concerned, I also do not like to exceptionalize journalists when it comes to the threat of surveillance in Egypt. I think surveillance, as manifested in both mass and targeted surveillance, as we have, corroborative evidence that the government is, engaging with both types, has been targeting both journalists and activists, but also even high targets within the government itself, because there is some deal of disintegration in the ruling ranks, but that's another issue. What can be said is two things. It is very dangerous how surveillance is conducted in a context where you have a complete legal loophole. So, in fact, the Telecommunication Act Act in Egypt has a provision that gives the government, through the intermediaries of internet service providers, the right to acquire any information about users that is deemed important in cases of national security. So we have a completely absent legal safeguards to any governmental quest for surveillance. And this is matched with a rising interest to acquire surveillance tools and surveillance software, both the expensive type of targeted surveillance and mass surveillance, and also increasing low-cost practices of surveillance, such as people using the mobile operators to acquire information about an activist or a journalist's movement, and the Facebook tracking and prosecuting people based on their Facebook statuses, which is a very low-cost type of monitoring that is happening. The second and last thing is that this rise in surveillance practices from the government is also, I think, raising some consciousness towards online security and privacy in Egypt, which has not been so much the case before. I think it's particularly the product of the last 2 years. There has always been the argument within the Egyptian activists and journalists milieus that we are not going to resort to anonymity the way our Tunisian friends would, for example, or our Iranian friends would, for example, because we think that we are better protected if we tweet using our very names, our very identities, and if we do the opposite, we might raise suspicions that we are in fact doing something suspicious. So I think this narrative is being revisited now, not in the sense that there is a celebration of anonymity necessarily, but there is a rising consciousness of security, and there is a rise in using encryption tools, even though encryption is outlawed in Egypt. There is a rise in using tools, protective tools of messaging, like Signal and Telegram and whatnot. And in general, there is, we know how, for example, the quest to be online and to be connected can trump security and privacy, but we see an increasing balance between those two things amongst the users community, particularly the most targeted one being journalists and activists, and that's interesting.
I know, Maricha, you want to jump in. I know you want to jump in, Maricha. I just want to comment. You mentioned our friends in Iran. And I've been covering Iran since the early 1990s, and just when the initial technology started to take off, whether it was mobile phones and SMSs, etc., they were very clever at cat and mousing. The minute they got caught, they built other ways around and barriers. And right now, just interestingly, coming to this plenary, I read in the FT that there's a whole movement now, because they don't think they can get their legal rights through the parliament or whatever, of online activism, and some of them seems to be bearing fruit, like certain criminal cases and other such things. But I want to, Maricha, you wanted to jump in, but I wanted also to put out some of the things that we want to ponder. We've discussed some of the its. Now, how do we, for instance, verify? You've talked about how we can keep things safe in various different countries, how we can balance, privacy versus flow of information. But how do we, is it even possible to have international standards in this regard? I mean, every country is different. I mean, didn't you just say there's not even any encryption in Egypt? Is there such a thing as an international standard to balance the need for intelligence gathering and surveillance versus privacy and freedom? Let me ask Maricha, and then I'll come to you, Rebecca.
Well, I think what we see in countries like Egypt, but also Iran, and in fact a lot of non-democratic countries around the world, is actually that perhaps in Europe we think too much that there is a global norm. I mean, if we look at the lessons from these uprisings of such brave people that took to the streets to ask for a more just, free, and prosperous society, that we thought that this in and of itself could set off fundamental change without our support, in fact, without clear regard for what our own role in Europe, in the United States, and in other democracies is in this regard. So, for example, the surveillance technologies that Limna talked about that are targeting journalists and citizens alike are often made in Europe, made in the United States, and to this day exported without any restrictions. I think it makes a lot of discussions about cybersecurity or human rights online so hypocritical if we don't target our own role and take our own responsibilities in this, because we in Europe have many laws that are looking at lawful intercept, whether there's a legal foundation for intercepting people's calls, like by the police when it comes to a suspect of a crime or something like that. But if you export those same monitoring networks, those same telecoms networks that are built within standards that assume the rule of law to countries where there is no rule of law, they have a very, very powerful, very harmful impact when they're in the hands of dictatorial regimes, intelligence services, secret services, etc. So I think that really has to be taken into consideration. And of course, we can only show political leadership that is credible when we are holding ourselves to the highest standards. When you were talking about Egypt, I was just remembering how there was a state of emergency for over 30 years. Now, that of course allows the government to set aside all kinds of legal provisions, however limited they may be. But sadly speaking, we see the same happening in Europe today. In France, the state of emergency was declared allowing for very far-reaching interventions by the government because of the terrorist attacks. And this is where I think we have to connect the dots and show true leadership on the basis of principles. The space for true press freedom is shrinking. Recent rankings show that only 13% of people worldwide live in a space where the press is free. And when we look at the global open internet and the role that technologies play, yes, they can be a force for good, but if we're not very, very clear in what is and is not allowed, what is and is not acceptable, it's going to be used as a force for harm.
Just quickly, are you concerned that some of the people who really do want to do us harm use our technology to their own advantage and so well and so rapidly?
Yes, of course, and this should be no surprise. I mean, a lot of the technologies have an impact depending on the people using them. And so it would be a mistake in any way to just stare stare blindly at the technologies in and of themselves. We have to look at the context within which they're used. Is it a democracy where the rule of law is respected? Is it a dictatorship where there is no rule of law? But we should also look at the people who are using the technologies and not expect either magic or Armageddon from the technologies in and of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree with Molice. I think media, policymakers, human rights groups have all had been guilty of sort of a teleological kind of belief in technology as being an inevitable force for good, which technology is technology. It's used by human beings. Human nature isn't changing, and we have to go from there. But to come back to your question originally about is there a common standard, and to connect it with what Marici was saying, there was an alliance of human rights groups, international human rights legal experts, a number of legislators in different places that came together and drafted something called the Necessary and Proportionate Principles for Surveillance and Human Rights. I recommend taking a look at it at necessaryandproportionate.org. It's a set of principles for accepting that you do need surveillance, you do need law enforcement, you do need national security. There's a way to approach surveillance in the digital age that can be compatible with international human rights norms. I'm sorry to say that even most Western countries, if not all Western countries, basically nobody is living up to the standard right now. So we do have a real problem with the more longer living established democracies sort of claiming that they can be exempt and not be held sufficiently accountable, that this is a problem. And if the world's democracies cannot set the right example for how you go about conducting law enforcement and surveillance for legitimate national security and law enforcement purposes in a manner that's accountable, that's proportionate, that can be prevented from abuse, by being kept within limits. If these cannot do this, then the rest of the world is in serious trouble. And you know, it comes down to human rights principles, and you know, you can't just say, oh, well, we have rule of law, and therefore we can do something very different with the technology, because then it gets applied everywhere.
Christian, you wanted to jump in?
Yes. Thank you. And I think probably I'm going to be politically incorrect, but here we are facing something that is completely true. Our keynote speaker said that we need to fight for the right to privacy, because that's give freedom of press, and then we have democracy, and this is give us liberty. But the fact is, when you don't have democracy, it's impossible to ask for right to privacy and freedom of press, which is something that I don't know how we say it's the cat who tries to eat the cue. It just means it's not possible. And then what I'm thinking here is that probably, yes, we need to improve and to face those challenges. And what are the means that we have? First of all, we need to continue to have very continued multi-stakeholder dialogue. Only the state engagement is important, but it's not enough. We need the academia, we need the private sector, the civil society engaged in these discussions. And for sure, you're going to have different levels of development. Yeah, but which is critical here is that those democracy, those Western democracies, or Latin American democracies, or the strong democracies in all around the world, are suffering now of that and are facing these challenges, and they are not, they are due to the fact of national security or political concerns. They are going against the privacy and how they manage the data from the persons and the information, the surveillance. And for my perspective, you know, I'm coming from a country without an army.
I know. Yeah.
Which means for us, the transparency is fundamental.
Yeah.
We don't have encrypted messages. I'm a diplomat. I don't send a cable to San Jose with the code, who is the person who has the code. No, it's very transparent, which is someone who wants to know what Costa Ricans are doing is very easy.
Why? And why is that? Is it because you don't think anybody wants to know what you're up to, or what?
Because it's so transparent and so easy to have it that finally, and we are not doing military things, and you know, our national security is based on the international law. Right. If something happens in my country, what we're going to do is to call the international community saying something is happening in my country. There is a violation of human rights. And that's why sometimes we name and change also Costa Rica. Not because we are very close to this position, but it's when actually we don't have these problems. But if tomorrow there is a situation that there is a systematic violations on human rights, we want to call up to you, that you come and you see up in our country.
Can I just pursue that? Because I mentioned, not just to flatter you, that I had been to Costa Rica, like many tourists, and I really enjoyed it. And because I'm a journalist, I ask a lot of questions. And obviously the fact that you do not have an army is pretty rare and significant, that your president, you know, won the Nobel Peace Prize for all sorts of reasons, including that. But what I also found, because you're talking about multi-stakeholders, that the Costa Rican people are stakeholders in their society from a very young age, whether it's behavioral in school, whether it's a national service of some sort, cleaning up the whatever, you know, when they leave school. I mean, there seems to be a national effort to make everybody stakeholders in the well-being of your country. And it's a very rare national endeavor.
I think it's due to the education, and this is why we are focusing on that. And because I think now that we need to in the early 40s, when we have this change of our mind and we abolish the army, we have this public education system that is coming from the 18th century. In Costa Rica in 1956, the public school for girls and boys was mandatory, which is incredible. At the same time, we abolished the death penalty. It's a very strange country, I must say. But we have this citizenship which is now, I think that we have to move for the digital citizenship. And this is to be educated and to know how the democracy... I was reading the Internet Privacy, Freedom of Expression, the book from the UNESCO, and they say that the Americans, 57% of the Americans think that they put everything on the Internet, they are safe. There is no... Which is mean they think that they are doing it at home, at home, and nobody is looking on that. Which is mean this is something that we have to be aware.
Right, and I was going to ask Danilo from his perspective as well. Again, you know, sort of state level, judiciary level. You've just said something, and Nina said it before. You know, this desire to be online, to be heard, sometimes trumps our young people, or actually anybody's, idea about how to safeguard their own privacy. So many people don't quite realize that every time they post, whether it's in the conventional social media or what the young people are doing now that often happens in sort of a darker zone, whether it's Snapchat or things that are immediately erased, they're growing up with a less acute a sense of personal and therefore institutional privacy. How does one deal with that, Danilo? Or is it a problem, do you think?
No, that's a very big problem. But I think that we must take into perspective that most young people are very much more literally concerned about privacy than us, even us. Yeah. There are research on that. Dana Boyd, the US researcher, has very good work on this, saying that many young people have many subtle, sophisticated means to protect their privacy, which we as parents and as adults generally aren't aware of. But let me check in another insight from what Christian said about the governance and the... I'm from a country without a general law that... So when we talk about surveillance and all the problems about social networks and data protection law, we lack a general legal framework to work with, primarily. But that's not the whole problem, the whole point. Brazil, on the other hand, has pushed for the UN resolution, right to privacy in digital age, helped to choose the rapporteur, Joe Canatati, and has some strength on this point at the international level. And we are becoming aware that the regulatory and the legal framework point of view are not enough to deal with the problems related to privacy and digital age. There's need to build a multi-stakeholder governance on these issues. Like our keynote speaker said, the Internet of Things are going to change so many things. And for instance, just to begin with, we have to put on the table people who are building the sensors for the Internet of Things, who are building the grid, the smart grid, and things like this. And this is not only a regulatory approach. This is a more general governance that should be approached unless we're, if you are wishing to have something effective.
We've got about, I would say, about another 25 minutes of this discussion. So let's go through with some of the things you may want to say that you haven't said, and then we'll take closing thoughts. Rebecca, you had your hand up.
Sure. You know, the issue of governments and, you know, they're operating within their national jurisdiction. And so one of the other problems that we have with sort of government action on the internet is that one government, particularly governments, there are a lot of large internet companies that operate globally, is that one government might pass some laws that are perhaps good for protecting their own citizens, but then cause a ripple effect across the global internet. But that particular government isn't accountable to internet users in Egypt or anywhere else. It's only accountable to its voters in its country. And some of us have advocated in a number of situations that when you have legislation that affects speech and personal data of internet users globally, we need to subject this legislation to a human rights impact assessment that looks at what are the implications of this particular piece of internet regulation globally. And another trend that we're seeing is that increasingly you're seeing companies that service global populations of internet users, and in other words, these companies have global constituencies, right? You know, so Facebook and WhatsApp and so on, and then Brazil trying to regulate Facebook. And Facebook, you know, is thinking about, okay, if I respond to this government this way, what message am I sending all over the world? So with Apple, coming back, you know, you mentioned Apple earlier. When Apple is defining the FBI, it's not just thinking about the context of the US legal system and US national security. They're thinking about what this means, what the implications are for their relations with all other governments and all users everywhere. And so you're seeing increasingly with these large companies, internet intermediaries, sort of a difference in their interests, or sometimes a gap in the interests of the companies and the national interests of many sovereign governments, which kind of brings us to this whole kind of stakeholder issue, is that when a company is taking an action or making a policy or making a technological decision, or a government is making a policy or trying to, you know, ban encryption or allow encryption, the implications affect all kinds of stakeholders that may not be voters, you know, that they're not technically beholden to. And so how you hold these powerful actors accountable in this globally interconnected situation, and how you hold governments accountable to the rights, you know, how you hold the British government accountable for the rights of people in Egypt when they're passing legislation that the British people are calling for because they want security, but it ends up having a really unfortunate impact in places like Egypt. What do you do?
What about the other issue that Miko, our keynote speaker, raised? He mentioned, you know, there's good hacking and there's bad hacking. And I think he said, correct me if I'm wrong, that the good outweighs the bad, that the forces of light outweigh the forces of evil. So this whole protection, surveillance, encryption conversation can be turned on its head when you look at what happened in Bangladesh recently, right? You have the Central Bank of Bangladesh being ripped off to the tune of 81 million or billion, I don't know how many dollars, but a lot of money, because these hackers managed to get into the SWIFT system. So you deal with some of these issues, Marie-J.
Yes.
That's a whole nother, you know, side of the privacy, encryption, surveillance debate.
Well, in a way, I think the way I look at it from a lawmaking point of view, we cannot let it depend on whether a hacker is good or bad. We need safeguards that are checked, that are enforceable, and that stand for real principles. But it's true that sometimes there's an opportunity in looking at the bigger context and the economic loss, for example, of not protecting people's data. We talk today in a very important context of human rights and the freedom of the press, which is key. And sometimes there is this alleged tension between freedom and security, between access by law enforcement or intelligence gathering and encryption, for example. But when it comes to banking, just to pick up on the example that you gave, you see that actually it cannot function well without safeguards. And so I think particularly in talking on government-to-government level to developing economies and countries where, you know, the discussion about how to deal with data protection. I mean, we just talked about Brazil, where there is no general data protection law in place. The opportunity is really to address this in a broader sense, to include economic arguments. But at the same time, even though there needs to be cooperation between the private sector and governments, I think, again, it has to be very clear where accountability, transparency, and checks and balances lie. Because I think that it's an illusion to think that the business models of major tech companies overlap with the public interest at all times. And even if it happens coincidentally, that's great, but we cannot depend on it. Right. And this is where I saw a very interesting research recently. It's a global trust barometer, which, just in the interest of looking at press freedom as well, it turned out that in the category media, search engines are the most trusted, and in all economic sectors, the tech sector is most trusted. Now, if we extrapolate that sense and look at how young generations access information, where they find news, and what the business models that are actually built on algorithms that are not transparent are focusing on is articles that are most clicked on, that are most sensational, which has nothing to do with a pluralist, open, free media landscape if you look at where we are today, maybe 5-10 years out. So we have to be very careful what principles we want to preserve and what role we wish to see for the private sector. And even if a majority of people don't think about what they post online, or even if a majority of people may think that national security is served by allowing all kinds of cybersecurity companies to take over, that still doesn't mean we can build on that. We have to stand for fundamental principles, and I think we really need sort of a wake-up call at the highest level in terms of how important this is and how rapidly the technologies are developing and how slowly rule of law and democratic decision-making are in relation to this. But
surely that's because, I mean, technology and algorithms work a lot faster than the human brain.
They do.
Right.
They do. And we still haven't even figured out whether we're going to implement algorithmic accountability. I mean, companies are saying that's our trade secret. It's the recipe to our Coca-Cola. We're never going to give it away. But if in my country, for example, 98% of people search in one particular search engine, and if that then becomes the most trusted media source, we have to think about what that means.
Yeah, that's another, dictatorship.
Well, nobody would call it that.
No,
if you look at the Netherlands, it ranks quite high in all the ranks of press freedom. Yeah. But the question is, what kind of bubbles or filter environments of filtered information are we allowing these companies to be built without oversight? And so I believe we need to broaden the discussion about access to information, freedom of expression, the right to privacy, data protection, and connect the dots between sort of the press freedom aspects, the internet freedom aspects, the global implications of decisions that are made, because what may make total sense in the name of national security in one country can actually mean a matter of life and death in another. So it's a complex but I think very important discussion.
I'm going to move to Lena in a second because I know you want to jump in, but might I dare ask if there's one or two questions from the audience, because we've been talking about a lot of things. It's not really a Q&A session, but I was told that if anybody wanted to, I could probably try to get one or two questions in. So while Lena's intervening in a second, whoever would like to ask a question, where is the microphone? Yeah, there's a microphone, a couple of microphones over here. And if one does ask a question, and again, I'm not telling you have to, it's just if anybody wants to, it really has to be a short question and not a speech. Thank you. Lena, go ahead.
Just a quick thought on also conversations about the importance of legal instruments to regularize, the way, surveillance is conducted and all that, is that I think in a context where the political environment is not sensitive at all to the basics of human rights standards, it becomes really pointless to talk about legal instruments. And again, in the specific case of Egypt, two pieces of legislations are about to pass, and they are both going to turn my own life into a nightmare as well as those of many others. And the main issue was both legislations, one being a cybercrime law and the other being a unified media law, is that on one hand, out of the state's increasing interest and suspicion toward the broad online space that is the internet, we are finding some exceptional legal measures taken online that are not found offline, for example. So for example, the cybercrime law criminalizes trespassing in a way that trespassing is not criminalized in an offline setting. In the same way, libel online means a different kind of penalty than it is on television, for example, when, libel on television arguably should be, penalized with, stronger measures because television reaches out to far more people in an context, for example. So there is this one problem on one hand, and the other problem is also at the same time collapsing the internet, the online space with the offline world. So in legislation such as the media law, we find now that if you are starting a media organization online, you need to get to be getting the same kind of permits and authorizations that you should get if you were a television or a newspaper, including if you also want to have a mobile responsive version on smartphones. You also need to get yet another sort of permit in order to be able to function there. So there is this strange illusion that the state has that they can control the internet in the very same way they control other offline spaces. So it's weird, you know. On one hand, they exceptionalize the internet, and on the other hand, and that's legal speaking, they also treat it as a space that they can control in the very same way as the offline space. And that's also emanating from the fact that none of these legislations, of course, are subject to any, you know, human rights assessments. And in the first place, they are not drafted by, you know, multiple stakeholders. They are drafted by none in the executive branch itself. So.
Thank you, Lina. There is a question. Who has the microphone? If you could stand up and just briefly direct your question. I am going to ask you to direct it to the gentleman at the end of the table.
Oh, I wanted to ask you.
Oh, me?
Yeah.
I'm not here to answer your questions, but carry
on. My name is Hasret. I'm from Azerbaijan, the country where Khadija is serving prison sentence. So I wish and I hope she will be freed soon. Of course, we don't want any journalists to be imprisoned, not only in Azerbaijan.
It's a question.
My question in regard to your position, just you mentioned that the United States are leader country in terms of freedom of expression and human rights. Mm-hmm. But 2 days we are here, and Finnish friends say that Finland is the first in terms of freedom of expression.
Do you know what? They're right, actually. They're right. Although it's around same time, ratings, 1776.
Finland is the first in ratings. So I think at least today, Finland is the
Yes, you're absolutely right.
First.
In fact,
Thank
I
you.
tweeted it. Thank you.
1776,
is it? 250 years of the first Freedom of Information law covered, as I said in my opening statement, here, which covers basically the territory that is modern-day Finland and Sweden. Thank you. Yes, go ahead, Christian. And we've got about 10 minutes left before I hand this over to the next part of this.
Very quickly, but only to answer your question, that what is the way forward? What I think that we have a platform. We have the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. We have the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which means this must be the base that we have to build on that. And for sure, we need to have this discussion with the stakeholders, but probably we need to elaborate something on a kind of protocol, I don't know, a kind of a group, which means we need consensus at the international level. And regarding which is one of the issues, the most challenging one is what we do with this private sector, those enormous companies that I think most of them have a budget bigger than Costa Rica and more power than. But I think that it's time probably also with the technology that we have. This is always working not in democratic countries. We have to say that clearly because but in democratic countries, probably we need to engage also the consumers and to ask them and say who is the provider that gave me the insurance that my data are safe. And that I have this insurance that this data not going to give to third ones or so. But I think that we have this little machine is kind of a digital citizenship, and give me also the power to do a lot of things, and probably has a lot of bad things. But we think that we have to. This is the kind of digital citizenship that I'm talking about. The education, how we can educate people, saying that the internet also have a lot of risk. And a lot of things that are good, but a lot of risk.
Yep.
And for sure, I must say that the other side of the coin is to have institutional for the rule of law. This is fundamental. But these two things, I think, and probably we need to also to engage in the multilateral forum to have discussions and to have another instrument who is for the 21st century. Thank you.
agree with that? What is your comment on that? Because it is obviously fundamental.
Yes, we have a very difficult question to address, and I believe that something that was said before also is worth taking to this point, that business models with public interest, that we have to take into account that, for instance, algorithms are doing a job which is not being followed by human rights. It also has been said, and maybe some traditional tools such as transparency are not enough to understand, to catch up with what algorithms are doing. And maybe we have to take a step back and take into account that algorithms are basically working with data, with personal data, with public data, with big data, and the nature of their data is so important to the output of algorithms. Yes, they are black boxes, but they depend so much on the nature of data that I taken this into a bit my field, which is privacy and data protection. But of course, some traditional tools of data protection legislation have, in my opinion, to be reread, to be updated, such as data collection limitation, the purpose principles. And I believe that we have something to do with algorithms to improve human rights. And it has to do with freedom of expression, of course, because people are reading what journalists are saying through Facebook. There's an algorithm who is writing this. And people in China, this is something that Joe Kanatashi observed, people in China are being submitted to a kind of credit score that they call citizen score, which is a kind of number the Chinese citizen is given on his compliance with some expectation for political power, which can include things that they are reading, information he's gathering, and this is so important to freedom of expression, such as other human rights, that I believe that privacy and data protection has a big role yet to be played on this field if read carefully.
Thank you, Danilo. I'm now going to consider those your two final statements, and I'm going to ask Lina, and then Rebecca, and then Marie-J, just to, in about a minute 30 each, for what you think is the most important for building the future and the biggest challenge and opportunity right now.
I think as far as my country is concerned, it is important for those of us who continue to be out of prison to push for the kind of independent journalistic practice that we want to defend, and not to let the paranoia of state surveillance flee or stop us from working. I know the cost is high, but also there is still a space to function, and there's a space to reverse, to some extent, many of the state's attempt to limit our freedoms through legislation, through actual arbitrary practices. So I think it's just a call to continue the struggle, because it is kind of possible to still be doing something out there.
Thank you. Rebecca?
Yeah, just concluding, I think it's pretty clear from a number of the remarks that have been made that the current sort of international legal system, sort of system of diplomacy, the way in which laws are made, the way in which corporations sort of govern themselves is not fit for purpose if we want to preserve human rights, freedom of expression, freedom of the press in the digital age. And we are going to need to come up with new mechanisms, more kind of multi-stakeholder mechanisms. How do we actually build systems of accountability based on human rights principles, which we have? They're fit for, the principles themselves apply as well to the digital space as they do offline. But we don't have the governance and accountability mechanisms to really implement them. And I think that's the real challenge for our generation. And I think Our friend from Costa Rica also pointed out an important point just in terms of citizenship. You know, there's a term netizen that has gotten a little tired over and overused in different contexts, but we really are citizens of a globally interconnected world. And not only do we need to hold governments accountable in terms of how they are exercising power over us, but we need to hold corporations. And sometimes governments are our ally in that, but sometimes we're actually allying with corporations against governments that are trying to invade our rights. And so it's sort of always shifting around in terms of the alliances of interest and opposition, and how we navigate that. I think it's just important for people who use technology not to be passive users and realize that you need to hold everybody who is creating, shaping, regulating this technology accountable, and you need to participate in its development so that it develops in a way that is actually compatible with the kind of world we want to have. We need to be active about it. And as journalists, we need to report actively on technology, not just as a tech story or a business story, but as this contested space in which our rights are not guaranteed, in which good is not inevitably going to prevail over evil, that it depends on every one of us and all the actors that are shaping this space to make sure that it is something where our rights can be exercised.
Thank you.
I fully agree with that. I think the open internet and new technologies have brought an enormous amount of possibilities to connect people, to enable their universal human rights, but it has also brought enormous new challenges. And I think the stakes are very, very high, and we are at a very crucial point right now where decisions will be made that will impact the future of the open internet and all its users. So yes, I agree we need multi-stakeholder approach that brings everybody to the table. It has to be inclusive, but we should also be very much aware that with greater power, whether it is countries or companies, comes greater responsibility. And that is not now the way every actor is operating. And I think there should be much more ethical considerations and ethical choices made on the part of private sector actors in the absence of laws, which we should also continue to develop. I'm all for human rights impact assessments and such deliberations to feed in much more into corporate decision making. And I think companies and governments alike should be much more aware of the global impact of their decision making. And I would hope that there would be a more credible and leadership from the open societies of this world. Our colleague from Costa Rica talked about the need for consensus around global norms. I agree, but we have to start with leadership, because consensus is going to be very complex without setting the bar extremely high and without showing that with determination. So for need new kinds of cooperation, not only between multiple stakeholders, but also between politicians and governments and citizens around the world who share these fundamental universal values of the need to respect human rights, to advance democracy and the rule of law in a globally connected world. So I think that there is space for leadership on the top and mobilization and network movements at the bottom, and I hope that they will reach out and connect in order to advance these principles that are under increasing pressure. So thank you
very much indeed. It's really fascinating discussion. Rebecca, Marice, Lina, Christian, and Danilo, thank you very much. And Miko, he's probably gone, but he gave a really provocative and interesting speech at the beginning. Everybody, thank you very much. That brings us to the end of this particular section. But there is a very important award being given in about a minute or so. It's the Global Forum for Media Development's Lifetime Achievement Award. And I'm going to hand over now to the wonderful ladies who are going to be presenting this part of this program. Thank you very much. Would you want to come up here? I think we should go. I think we'll go off the stage while you do this, or how do you want to do this? Yeah, why don't you, well, there's that mic, those mics over there you might want to use. Or you can sit down. It's up to you. Yes, that's probably easier.
go down.
Okay, my name is Leon Willems, and I'm the chairman of the Global Forum for Media Development and the director of Free Press Unlimited.
And I'm Joyce Barnathan, the former chair of the GFMD and president of the International Center for Journalists. And we want to thank UNESCO for giving us a few minutes to honor someone very special in our field.
Okay, we all know that advocating for a vibrant and independent media in this world is a very challenging job. Successes are hard-won, but there are people who dedicate their life to this cause, and one of these people we want to speak about now is Bettina Peters.
Bettina is the founding executive director of the Global Forum for Media Development, and our group is a membership network with 200 dues-paying media assistance organizations from around the globe. And for 5 years, Bettina coordinated GFMD's efforts to gain recognition for the key role that the news media play in civil society.
During her tenure, she was an articulate advocate in English, German, and French for our organization and our cause. Her optimistic spirit helped bring hundreds of disparate media development groups together under one roof to coordinate activities and make the case for supporting our important field.
Her achievements are many. First among them, she has a knack for getting people to work together under the GFMD umbrella. We received many lovely testimonials from our members citing her endless energy, her remarkable courage, and her unwavering commitment to people and organizations everywhere from Albania to Ukraine.
Thanks to a campaign coordinated by Bettina, GFMD helped stop a European Union aid program to establish Pan-Africa Media Council that threatened to extend state control over the news media.
Before joining GFMD, she was director of programs at the European Journalism Center, and before that, she worked at the International Federation of Journalists. Now she is the director of development at Thomson Foundation.
Bettina recently took ill, and we are all hoping for a speedy recovery. But we wanted to be sure to recognize her optimism, her intelligence, and her contribution to media development.
So today, we are delighted to present her with the GFMD Lifetime Achievement Award. The founding chair of the GFMD, David Hoffman, could not be present, but he's here with us in spirit. And accepting this honor on Bettina's behalf is her partner, Aidan White.
Let's have a big round of applause.
Thanks very much. Bettina has been moved to tears many times in recent months by the overwhelming messages of support and affection she's received. And so she's asked me to say a few words on her behalf in receiving this wonderful award. Dear colleagues and friends, the downside of knowing in advance that you will receive an award is that everyone expects you to come up with a half-decent speech. It's like the Lifetime Achievement Award versus Best Actress at the Oscars. If you win Best Actress, you can pretend to be surprised and overwhelmed. Not that I would want to equate World Press Freedom Day with the Oscars, even though we have our own red carpet full of press freedom heroes. This event may not have the glamour of Oscar night, but UNESCO's promotion of free speech rights and its support for media development makes it a star in its own right. I want to thank them for allowing me to take up your valuable time. In fact, everyone in media development owes UNESCO a debt of gratitude for coming up with the Windhoek and subsequent declarations on promoting independent and pluralistic media. For a generation, they have been a key reference for anyone fighting for press freedom. It is definitely the icing on my own modest cake to receive this wonderful award. The cake having been able to earn a living by doing something that I believe is worthwhile, building viable quality media and supporting independent journalism. I was lucky enough to start my first real job 26 years ago at the International Federation of Journalists. Just after the wall had come, I could see real international solidarity at work. Later, I worked at the European Journalism Centre, where I had the opportunity to focus on one important aspect of media development, bringing together journalists and other media professionals from different countries around common professional values. And then, as you've heard, I was very grateful for the privilege of being chosen as the Global Forum for Media Development's first director. Working with so many committed media development professionals to build an umbrella group that can speak on behalf of the community has been a great experience. I am so pleased that the GFMD is stronger than ever, and I must thank the GFMD leaders in particular for taking up the idea of giving me this recognition. My current work with the Thomson Foundation has allowed me to help build viable media and to focus again on practical journalism training. I also found out that my colleagues at the foundation were wonderfully supportive and helpful when I fell ill last October. And this has been the main lesson of the last 6 months. So many former colleagues at the IFJ, the EJC, and the GFMD, people I worked on a project with, or people I just ran into at conferences like this, have been sending messages of support. I can attest that the media development community is a great group of people, men and, thankfully, more and more women, who are full of warmth and friendship. I am humbled by receiving this recognition from you, from a community of supporters of media freedom and independent journalism that includes so many of my heroes. Thank you.
Let me put it on a box for you, because it won't be impossible to carry otherwise.
So with that, we conclude the session. Thank you all for attending.
That comes along with it. And we still need to sign that.